Hello, everybody. So, my failure to fix my camera is rather sad. I tried my best, and I think that this is actually happening kind of with good timing, but also at the same time, it's not. So, I apologize for the camera quality. I know my camera actually completely went kaput the last time. So, I have some pretty decently big news. I don't know if any of you guys have heard, but Jane Goodall, the renowned primatologist, had passed away on Wednesday, October 1st, 2025. So just a couple days ago. And most of the world is mourning her passing, giving her accolades, correctly glazing her for the work that she's done to publicize chimpanzees and dispel myths and misconceptions involving great apes. However, Jane Goodall is also part of an engineered, I guess you could say, or contrived agenda to anthropomorphize animals that exist in academia and in broader science. And it's easy to divorce the person from their work in this case, because Jane Goodall genuinely was a philanthropic and well meaning person. However, she also represents a major problem that we find in not just primatology, but the entire field of biology, and that is the overestimation of animal intelligence, especially compared to human beings, and the capacity of animals to both feel and emulate human emotion as we understand it. So, in order to understand Jane Goodall, we kind of have to go back to the beginning and understand, how are apes and great apes in general even viewed by humans? Originally, it was thought that you couldn't even have a woman around a great ape. You couldn't have a woman around something like a gorilla because the chance of her being great, I guess you could say, or SA'd by this animal. There was a ton of misconceptions involving the behavior and ethology of apes that needed to be clarified, and very few people were willing to do that research objectively. Before Jane Goodall, most primatology research was focused on simply studying the diet of chimpanzees and gorillas, their general anatomy, but not very much thought was given to the idea that they could express any more higher intelligence than any other animal. The idea that apes were highly intelligent was known about, but it wasn't really rigorously studied until Jane Goodall. So, what she did was basically go out and observe small groups and larger groups of chimpanzees and gorillas over extended periods of time and observe their behavior. And that gave us a huge amount of data. That said, there's aspects of Jane Goodall's work, especially over the years, that has fallen under scrutiny. Many of the claims that she makes about chimpanzees, claiming that they have emotions that are evocative and even similar to ours. The idea that tool use is something that is inherent or universal among chimpanzees, and that all chimpanzee groups have the ability to acquire tool use and potentially even go on from there. We see that chimpanzees can indeed use tools, even things as complex as primitive spears and twigs, which I'll get into. However, it must be noted that there's a multitude of physiological and neurological differences between human beings and chimpanzees and any other great ape. So, one of the biggest things we have to address first and foremost is that chimpanzees, great apes, all of these things, we are not proven to be descended from these creatures. There are 40 million base pair differences between a human being and chimpanzee. They're saying, oh, we're 98% similar genetically. We're 95% genetically similar to a rat. We're 70% genetically similar to a banana. Just because genetics falls along templates, one of the biggest assumptions in biochemistry and genetics is that, oh, it's fine if we have convergences physiologically to explain our theories, but there's no such thing as genetic convergences, scaffolding, etc. When we find regulatory genes that determine that an animal has a cephalic or head end and a caudal or tail end, that's a pretty universal bilaterian structure, but we use it as proof of descent to say that we all descend from one bilaterian ancestor, and yet we acknowledge there's all kinds of convergences in nature. A thylacine isn't related to a coyote just because they look similar, right? And yet these convergences in genetics are never acknowledged. We apparently all descended from one single bilaterian. The genes for bilaterians, even if they follow a similar design or program, isn't that the most logical way it would develop in the first place, to have specific regulatory genes code for these regions sequentially? But no, So, this idea that human beings and chimps are somehow connected in the deep past is part of what feeds into Jane Goodall's research. Part of what she was trying to prove is that chimps and gorillas are not just they're not just animals. They're not just apes. They have some sort of spark of intelligence within them that is shared with humans. And unfortunately for Jane Goodall, that ethology research, although it has been extremely useful from a data standpoint, a lot of that data has been twisted and marred by her own conjecture, by her own assumption that these animals are more emotionally and cognitively complex than they actually really are, and also highly exaggerating how human like these apes are. I think one of the most damaging aspects of Jane Goodall's work over time, the good is understanding and actually approaching animal ethology in an objective way with long term studies. That long term study format is what gets us the best data because it actually shows us the differences in animal behavior. The downside is that she injected so much sub I mean, what I can't even say it anything anywhere else. Her blatant bias for these animals into her work. She got attached to these animals and she started describing to them traits and characteristics that colored and flavored almost all of her work. And this is why the replication crisis exists. This is why, in multiple other examples, I'm going to give you at least one other example from another scientist who worked on language, where it was proven that, oh, instead of actually learning lexicograms, it's more, it's a false association. The assumption that the chimpanzees are capable of language, they're not. They're basically parroting you like a parrot does. They're using suggestion to figure out and be trained as to what to associate symbols with. It's not an inherent association, as we'll see when we get deeper into tool use. So, I don't say this just to be a hater, and I'm not saying this to denigrate her life or anything, but we need to understand that emotionally driven science is part of the reason why academia is in the state it's in now. When you have fields like psychology that are 95% irreplicable, and when you have biology, which is almost three-quarters of all papers published in zoology and natural science are irreplicable. You cannot, with the same methodology, replicate the data results. And that is something that is incredibly detrimental to the future of science. In fact, that's a big reason why science as a field has mostly stagnated outside of medicine and technology. We're trying to find comprehensive methods of figuring out how to best live and serve and protect the natural world, and yet almost all the science that we're putting out is inherently biased and inherently promoting a specific agenda and not really trying to figure out the truth. And one of the biggest agendas being promoted is this idea that human beings and apes are somehow deeply connected and intertwined. This simply is not proven. And you'll hear it all the time. 98% genetically similar. Look at this, look at that. And yet we ignore and obfuscate the 40 million base pair differences, which, if you look at the number of generations, that's 450,000 generations. Human beings and chimpanzees, our generation times aren't actually that distinct. So even accounting for the average generation time between them and being very generous with that, that's 44 unique mutations per generation. You'll be lucky to, and as I've shown with my PopGen examples in previous videos in my critique through history, what you'll see is actually the PopGen shows us that it takes thousands of years for one, and that's assuming the 15, 20-year generation time. It takes thousands of years for even one gene to reach fixation, and oftentimes even beneficial genes like lactose tolerance don't reach fixation in a population in that time frame. In population genetics, what we see is that mutations accumulate very slowly, and it takes dozens, if not hundreds, of generations for a single mutation to reach fixation. And yet, we're told that dozens of mutations not only emerge but reach fixation within 6 million years. If you actually look at the base genetic mutation rate of hominids and chimps and other great apes and you compare them together, you don't get a human being splitting off from chimps 6 million years ago. You have to go all the way back to the Oligocene to even get anywhere close to what we're looking at from a genetic standpoint. So even looking at the raw data, we're not seeing that human beings and chimpanzees are even that closely related. Again, 95% genetic similarity to a squirrel, and yet they're going on and on about 98% similarity. Most of our DNA is just junk DNA, guys. A lot of it is scaffolding. A lot of it is straight up just building blocks stacked on top of each other. A lot of it is just template. And we don't understand how genetics actually even works, which is the funniest part to me. We're so infantile in our understanding of genetics that it really just makes me laugh when people try to be conclusive. And our entire idea of phylogenetics, like when they found out that those two ants, there was an ant species that they discovered just recently who was able to clone males from another complete a different species that separated 8 million years ago, and yet these males are used to create their hybrid workers. Now they're like, oh, this species can create another species, instead of asking themselves, like, maybe species is a contrived subjective construct. The idea of a species in and of itself is made up. So this entire idea of evolution is made up. The very building blocks of evolution is made on subjective assumption that one species can turn into another, yet you can't define a species and you can't actually give us the actual determiner for this change. You claim it's random mutation and natural selection, and yet sexual selection and the base mutation rate of organisms have all disproven this. Natural selection is not the sole driver of evolution, and random mutation is insufficient to show us what diversity actually exists in nature. By all of your models and all of your predictions, this hasn't come to pass. So, from a raw data perspective, it's hard to argue this. But when you have scientists coming up and trying to humanize animals for conservation purposes, because most of Jane Goodall's agenda, of course, was to conserve these animals to make them not seem like violent, dangerous beasts and make them seem more human. Except the issue is that they are violent, dangerous beasts. They're no more less dangerous than a lion or a hyena. In fact, when it comes to human injuries, they have mauled more people than jaguars have. And yet we're continually seeing this narrative of how compassionate and emotional these apes are when they barely have a functioning frontal cortex, especially something compared to humans. So let me actually show you guys. So here's Jane Goodall's website. So she passed away on Wednesday, and here her website is talking about her legacy in science. So, from the day she began her legendary chimpanzee research in Gombe, Jane Goodall took an unorthodox approach to her subjects. And I'm actually going to get into the Gombe War. The Gombe War is something that I'm going to basically just pull up in the background, because a lot of her research was done to kind of it was a lot of it was done to try to humanize or just emotionalize these chimps in their research. But as we'll see with the Gombe War, there's clearly some issues with how she approached this, and kind of the image that she presented to the world in terms of how these Gombe chimps acted. She immersed herself in their forced habitat with a fresh perspective of a mind uncluttered by academia. Now, that's utterly untrue. Academia, although academia was claiming at the time, some academics were claiming that chimps were just like any other animal, just like any other beast, that they were even dangerous to be, around women because of their sexual appetite. Um, don't get it twisted. A lot of what she was doing very much was tied into academia at the time. A large amount of this push, remember, she's doing her work in the mid 60s. She got her PhD in ethology from the University of Cambridge in 1965. This is, if you remember, around the same time that many scientists, especially atheists and socialists in academia, were pushing a narrative of not only abiogenesis and the Big Bang and all of these different ideas in physics and science were coming about. Another big one was human origins. This idea that we're finding these primitive human fossils like the Neanderthal, and trying to find some sort of connection between human beings and apes. This goes back to a large scale subversion of academia that I've talked about that happened since the late 50s. When you see what's happening in academia and you see how big she got, if you truly were slandered and shunned by academia, you would not be a household name. Period. You're not going to be a household name by doing that. It's ridiculous. This idea that she somehow is bucking the trend in academia when she's one of their biggest mouthpieces. And so here it begins. The Institute claimed that she bucked against the grain, and yet she's a household name and propped up by academia for decades. She set a new standard for the study of apes in the wild, experiencing their complex society as a fellow neighbor rather than a remote observer. And see, this is the issue right here. You're not a neighbor. This humanization of the chimp inherently reduces the value of what you're doing, because you're no longer doing objective scientific observation. You are a remote observer. You're not a neighbor to this chimp. Just by even saying the word neighbor, a fellow neighbor, you're already trying to humanize this animal in a way that it's not. She said, coming to know and interact with them as individuals over many years. And so already you can see just in the first paragraph of her society how much she already is known for anthropomorphizing these animals. And once you anthropomorphize an animal, every single behavioral aspect is going to be filtered through the lens of human behavior. It's intrinsic, it's something that happens automatically. With open eyes and an open mind, Dr. Jane Goodall made discoveries that rock the scientific world, forever changing the way we look at our closest living relatives and ourselves. Because again, the narrative that they're trying to push is that human beings and chimps are just two sides of the same coin. Our bestial side is the chimp, but we have this refined side that's just more evolved. And yet, what we actually see from chimp neurology and human neurology too is that the differences couldn't be more startling. Chimps in reality have very little to do cognitively with human beings. So she said the revolutionary discoveries that Dr. Goodall made through her field work with chimpanzees are a wonder to the scientific world. Her findings suggest that many behaviors once thought exclusively human may be inherited from common ancestors that we shared with chimpanzees millions of years ago. And here we go. This is where we're at. Right here in bold font is the entire point of her research. To claim that you're unbiased, that you're bucking the trend of academia, and yet all of your research is being used to try to justify this shaky hypothesis that human beings and chimpanzees have a common ancestor, that we descended from a chimp-like ancestor, and chimps and humans went their own separate ways, but chimps stayed in their primitive bestial forms, and humans just, well, we just took on our own. We went down our own path. And yet more and more findings suggest that this is simply not the case. Human beings, the similarities between human beings and chimps are so greatly exaggerated, even from a biochemical perspective, that nowadays anybody doing any amount of digging into this is going to quickly realize, wow, this is actually a huge crock of crap. The human beings and chimpanzees are actually not really that similar. From our endocrine system, our skeletal system, our neurological development, our immune systems. They'll cherry pick all of these similarities, but then ignore these gigantic differences that genuinely separate us from chimps. Our digestive systems are more similar to dogs than they are to chimpanzees. And yet we're constantly being told how we're related to chimpanzees. Are we related to dogs because our digestive systems actually happen to be much more homologous to them? Is the fact that we have a hidden estrus make us more similar to like koalas or something? Like, I don't understand what this idea is, this ham-fisting this relationship just because what they kind of look human-like. Again, acting like convergences on one end, convergences between the thylacine and dogs. Oh, they separated in the late Jurassic. Just because it looks like a dog doesn't mean it's related to a dog, and yet they'll point right to chimpanzees and gorillas and be like, "Oh, we're related to them. There's our closest common ancestor, and look, our genetics are so similar." Again, 40 million base pair differences. It's insanity. It's genuine insanity. That's 20 million base pair differences per lineage branch, 44 unique mutations per generation. People are like, oh, but what about translocation and chromosome, amalgamation and blah 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 blah. All of these things horribly detrimental when it actually happens in wild populations, and it's rare for karyotype shenanigans to ever become fixed in a population. It always happens in just singular individuals. So you're telling me a single individual translocated as a part of its chromosome and suddenly that reached fixation somehow, some way? We don't see that in population genetics. It takes eons, well, not literal eons, but it takes hundreds, if not thousands, of generations for a single gene to reach fixation, let alone drastic restructurings to the genome. Now, if we actually go on from here and we keep reading, what you'll see is the more we discover about these kindred beings, the deeper our insight to what it means to be human. Again, because they have this idea that there's a link between human beings and chimps. And they're saying chimpanzees make and use tools. Chimpanzees hunt and eat meat. Waging war is not only human, compassion runs deep. Chimpanzees have strong mother-infant bonds. And yet, when we actually look into the research, one, they're not waging war. Groups of chimps go to other chimps and horrifically maul them. You see that in gray wolves. Gray wolves don't wage war on other gray wolves. Hyenas don't wage war on other hyenas. Lions don't wage war on other lions, but the exact same behavior in chimps is war, proof that they have war. Well, because they're cannibals that rip each other's balls off, and like I don't get it. They kill and eat each other just like any other animal does. And yet it's apparently proof of warfare. They don't use tools in war. They don't use organized tactics any more organized than a lion does, or gray wolves do, or hyenas do. Nothing near where a human. Oh, and they hunt and eat meat. Oh, they're omnivores. That clearly means that we're related to them, even though their diet is basically only 10% meat. Human beings eat far more meat than chimpanzees do. And oftentimes when chimpanzees eat meat, it's either monkeys or other chimps. And they use and make tools. And I'm about to show you a paper where not only do a minority of chimps use tools, some chimps, many chimps, never are able to learn how to use tools. It is not a ubiquitous behavior among chimps. Chimps have to spend almost a decade of their lives learning how to put a stick in a termite mound. Their cognition is so far below our capacity that people genuinely don't understand it. They have no conceptualization of the massive gulf that human intelligence presents between any other animal on Earth. They assume every animal is just one light bulb moment away from having human intelligence. And that simply is not true. And I'm going to show you. But, this is the Jane Goodall Institute. Now, moving on from there, we have to ask ourselves the question, okay, you've been talking, mad shat this whole time. So let's go and look at some actual genuine examples that disprove this, or at least, throw a bit of a wrench into it. So one thing I'm going to show now. So let's see here. I think another good example would be this. So let's look at this. Here's another paper that kind of shows us what we're working with. So chimpanzee versus humans, what are we working with? I'm gonna actually open this Jane Goodall because StreamYard's being dumb. So legacy of Jane Goodall, all fine and good, right? Like she's the best of the best, whoop de whoop. So what's the difference between human beings and chimps? Both species have opposable thumbs, and yet chimps really can't use their thumbs as well as we do. Complex social structures and the ability to use tools. Again, this use of tools is not ubiquitous among chimps. It's more common among female chimps than it is male chimps. And among chimps, I think the paper says that only like a quarter of chimps can use tools? Versions of lexicograms. Chimps are naturally violent. I'm trying to find oh, here we go. We actually look at the data. I'll show you this, but ant dipping, 20 observations, club stones, tool use, number of tools made. And I think they were studying these Thai chimpanzees. I'm trying to see how many of them they actually included so I can actually get a solid number. And of course, this is the issue with modern papers is that they actually omit valuable data. I don't even think they're actually telling us how many ants there or how many chimpanzees they actually were studying, which is really annoying. And again, a good example of why most of these studies are hot garbage. But I like this study because it actually indicates and shows us, if not outright tells us, that these chimps basically, only a minority of chimps actually use tools. And only observed, yeah, like 14 times. Okay, so going back to the paper, so talks about tool use. Humans have evolved larger brains and more advanced cognitive abilities, blah, blah, blah. While chimps exhibit some level of self awareness, problem solving skills, humans have much greater capacity for abstract thinking and creativity. Not only do we have much greater capacity for abstract thinking and creativity, we almost completely dominate them. They're not even unique. Dolphins have greater cognitive ability than chimpanzees do. Chimpanzees are not the second smartest creatures on earth. Well, I'm just gonna say that. Orcas, dolphins, elephants, all three of these animals absolutely mog chimpanzees when it comes to intelligence. Chimps don't come close to either one of these three animals when it comes to cognition. These violent psychopathic beasts, although chimps are cool, but let's be real here. Chimps are not that much different than lions, hyenas, or any other large African animal when it comes to intelligence. There's other monkey species that can crush and eat shellfish with rocks. And it takes them nearly as long to learn how to do that as chimpanzees do just by ant dipping. 14 known observations in troops of dozens of chimps, and usually by the same group of females. Most males don't know how to use tools in chimp society. That's just how it is. So they say we share physical attributes such as opposable thumbs, and yet their thumbs are not nearly as dexterous as ours, forward-facing eyes, the ability to walk upright. Which, again, greatly exaggerated. They barely can do this. And even if they do, their hip morphology and pelvic morphology is completely different than ours. There are significant differences between the two. Chimpanzees have longer arms and shorter legs. Humans have larger brain size and more developed vocal cords. And he doesn't mention our endocrine systems, our immune systems, none of these things. None of these major, major differences biochemically between human beings and chimpanzees. Digestive system, respiratory system, musculoskeletal system. So they say that human beings are social and live in groups. They form communities led by an alpha male, while humans have more complex social structures that include families, communities, and societies. Chimps exhibit behaviors such as grooming, playing, and forming alliances within their groups, similar to humans. Well, let's be clear, grooming, playing, and forming alliances is exactly what lions and cheetahs do. Again, none of these behaviors are unique to chimpanzees. It's not like, oh, chimpanzees groom and form social bonds. I'm like, yeah, so do other African wildlife. The elephants do this. Hyenas do this. African wild dogs do this. Lions do this. All species of hyena do this to some degree. Hippos do this. Like, dude, nothing you're mentioning in that article is even unique to humans. Again, just because, oh, it has opposable thumbs, and yet its hand morphology is completely different than ours. Have you seen a chimp's hands? Opposable thumbs, my ass. If you really are talking about hand morphology, our hand morphology is not even that similar. They have a closer hand morphology to a gibbon than they do to us, because gibbons are also apes. For being great apes, the fact that we can throw things effectively, run on two legs, sweat, have hidden estrus, all of these things that we just are total. And even when we look at like our vocal abilities, our brain morphology, skull shape, our digestive tract, like I mentioned, being more similar to that of a canid than it is to an ape, all of these differences in human beings compared to chimps, like even our reproductive behavior, you'd think that our reproductive behavior would at least be similar if we're descended from apes, but no. Completely different endo reproductive system. Our endocrine system and reproductive systems could not be more alien to one another. Could not be more different. Humans don't have a pseudobaculum like chimpanzees do. Women don't have a red butt and have, we have hidden estrus. Completely different pheromone cocktail mix. Completely different cycles for how our estrus works. It's just night and day. It's not even remotely close. And yet this is consistently presented to us. Chimpanzees are known for the problem-solving skills and cognitive skills. They can learn to use tools, communicate through gestures and vocalizations. And this is one that I'm going to debunk really quickly. They use gestures and vocalizations to communicate. You know who else uses gestures and vocalizations to communicate? Every other large African animal that's social. Elephants, hippos, giraffe. I mean, the fact that giraffe are vocal, we thought that giraffe were non-vocal, but even they can do that. Communicating through gestures and vocalizations is something almost every single remotely intelligent African animal can use. Even rock hyraxes can do this. Demonstrate self-awareness through a mirror study that is non-conclusive in chimps, actually. Chimps were non-conclusive when doing the mirror study, which is hilarious. Humans are considered to be more intelligent overall. What? We're considered to be more intelligent? No, bro, we definitely are more intelligent. With higher levels of abstract thinking, creativity, and ability to plan for the future. Humans have developed complex languages, art, music, technology, showcase their advanced cognitive skills. And that's just, I don't even know what to say to that. That's just ridiculous. Both chimpanzees and humans experience a wide range of emotions, including joy, sadness, fear, anger, and empathy. Now, here we go. This idea that complex emotion can happen with a underdeveloped prefrontal cortex is retarded. It's retarded. If you want to understand what I'm saying, just look at the difference in brain size between a chimpanzee and a human being. If you really want to make these people look dumb, and I'm not even going to go into the next two parts, evolutionary history. I'm not even going to waste my time because we already know that that's I already wasted enough time talking about evolution, why evolutionary history is dumb. But look at that. Look at the difference in brain size between a human being and a chimpanzee. Look at the massive difference in brain size. The massive difference in size between the frontal cortex of a human being and the frontal cortex of a chimpanzee. That is insane. That is an insane difference to have between these two animals. And quite frankly, dudes, like, I think one of the biggest issues that we're probably going to face soon is this entire notion that human beings and chimpanzees is like this idea that humans are descended from monkeys. And look at the difference in brain size. They experience joy and empathy. No, they don't. No, they don't. Their brain is tiny. Tiny brains. For animals their size, it's astounding that you even have the nerve to claim that that they even hold a candle to us cognitively. The averages between these brains, what, 200 to 400 cc's? A chimp's brain, like what? It's 1/4 the size of a human being's, and you're going to sit here and claim they could feel joy and empathy and all of these complex higher emotions. There's human beings. No, they don't have empathy. They eat their own. They eat their own kind. If a chimp dies or its baby gets snatched, they'll eat their own baby. They'll eat their own members. And they're like, well, humans do this too. I'm like, no, humans ritualize their cannibalism at least. Chimps don't even think about it. Chimps don't mourn. Chimps don't feel sad. Chimps don't feel. It's like this is all of these assumptions with an animal whose frontal cortex is literally 1/4 the size of ours, and you're going to ascribe it all of these cognitive abilities. That's just where I'm sick of modern girl boss science. This idea that science is just, wow, that's really bright. This idea that science is just this grab bag for anybody to get. Oh, I have a PhD, so suddenly I'm really intelligent, know what I'm talking about. Except that you don't. Like, I really hate to break it to you, but just because you have a PhD doesn't mean you're not retarded. Doesn't mean you have a take that's actually worth listening to. And the unfortunate thing about people like Jane Goodall is that people do. She talks about how compassionate they are, and oh, look how the mother bonds with its baby, and it's making a bed out of leaves. And she romanticizes and embellishes and tells us all of these wonderful things about chimpanzees. Tells us how complex they are and how empathetic they are. And that was the narrative, because the Gombe War was before all this happened before the Gombe War. All this happened before we knew that chimpanzees were cannibals. All this happened before we knew that chimpanzees would brutally not even murder, brutally kill other chimps and show themselves to be no different than any other large African animal. Up to this point, we acted like chimps were like a utopian beings. They revised most of this when they learned of when the Gombe War happened. And here we go. Let's actually look at this. Are oh so intelligent, enlightened, and empathetic chimpanzees, and yet when we actually get down to business, what do we see? The brutal history of the Gombe Chimpanzee War. So this is the same exact population that Jane Goodall studied. The exact same chimps that she talked about how they were so empathetic. They had joy and they experienced sadness and all these complex human emotions. and they brutally hunt down and eat each other. Oh yes, our empathetic chimps that are totally just a mirror of humanity act no different than any other large African animal. Shocking beyond words. There's nothing that discredited Jane Goodall's research more than this. And they used all kinds of backwards hand gestures and all kinds of mental gymnastics to try to salvage this woman's narrative. She's literally proven to be a hack in real time with the same chimps that she was studying for all those years and talking about how empathetic they were. And here we go. Chimps are generally regarded as amiable and nonviolent creatures, partially because of her narrative. Jane Goodall did not dispel the myth that chimpanzees were these decent, these gentle, nonviolent creatures. The going theory at the time is that they were violent grapists and no different than any other knuckle-dragging beast. They were considered to be primal and bestial. Then Jane Goodall came along and gave this whole kumbaya narrative of how chimpanzees live in peace and are compassionate and loving. And then they have the nerve to say, at the time, chimpanzees were generally regarded as amiable and nonviolent creatures. That's because Jane Goodall was the one pushing that idea. Her research revealed the complexity of chimpanzee behavior, including their capacity for violence, political alliances, and territorial disputes. Yeah, because early on in her career, she tried to give this idea, again, like we just saw, talking about how, oh, they have all of these complex emotions. And yet, late in her research, going at the Gombe War, and then also let's just ignore the fact that she got involved with the World Future Council and the climate cult. Let's just forget the fact that Jane Goodall spent a large part of her later life promoting climate change propaganda and overpopulation panic and all this other shit. Like, forget that part of her legacy because we're just talking about her actual research as it involves, the scientific field. But she's the one that pushed this in the first place. And the Gombe War was a gigantic hole in the boat for her entire narrative that she just tried to casually wrap it into the rest of her research. But how are you going to push this narrative of the empathetic chimp when the Gombe War showed chimp brutality in its most egregious and obvious form? That these are not anything close to resembling human beings at all. Even the most brutal human conflicts don't reflect the bestial savagery of the Gombe War. So this erupted in 1974. So this talks about the outbreak of the war, and I think that Count Dankula did a good summary of this. So Godey was ambushed, beaten with a rock, although he escaped. He was never seen again. So apparently they say they used a tool. Again, there's no actual, I actually dug into this. There's no evidence it was beaten with a rock. He was likely just beaten, probably castrated, probably had his face ripped off or something, and then died of blood loss and shock. And again, they said this marked the first recorded instance of chimpanzees killing one of their own team, a shocking revelation for Goodall and her team. It was shocking because up to this point, Jane Goodall had been shilling a message that chimpanzees were empathetic, kumbaya, harmonious beings that lived in harmony because she found a cohesive chimp group that had one dominant male, and she just saw it as this Shangri-La of, oh, look how complex their society, look how compassionate they are. No, they were being bullied into compliance by a single alpha male. The moment that broke down, it was a bloodbath. It was a shocking revelation because of the narrative she was pushing about chimpanzees being human-like. Over the next 4 years, Humphrey's group systematically targeted the Kahama males. Dee and Hugh were ambushed and killed, often while they were foraging alone. Even Goliath, who had been friendly with the Kasakela, again friendly, fell victim to an attack. The relentless assaults continued until all the Kahama males, including young Sniff, were dead. The Kasakela then turned their attention to the Kahama females, killing some, causing others to disappear, and assimilating the rest. Initially, Goodall findings were met with skepticism. Critics accused her of anthropomorphizing the chimpanzees and influencing their behavior through their interactions. And see, I'm not the first guy to call her out. You think that I'm some wackadoodle on here talking about this? People have been calling out Jane Goodall for years. People have spent years calling out Jane Goodall. She has been anthropomorphizing and churning a yarn about these chimps for years, and it's created a dangerous precedent, not only in ethology, not only in primatology, but the entire field of zoology. Her anthropomorphizing of animals is so obvious and on the nose that it discredits and makes irreplicable huge broad swaths of her research. All of this research is being colored by her own perception and emotions being reflected back on it. She's projecting emotions onto chimps that they don't have. All of these years, she's projecting this idea of empathy, compassion, intelligence, cognitive complexity, etc., etc., etc. And then she's faced with the harsh reality of what chimps are. Once those rose tinted glasses get put off, once the dominant male disappears, falls from grace, suddenly you see the real side of chimps, that they're no different than any other African animal. They're no different than lions. They're no different than from hyenas. They're no different than wild dogs. They're no different than any other large omnivore, predator, social creature in all of Africa. At the end of the day, they display very similar social behavior to any other pack animal. As a matter of fact, lions demonstrate just as much social complexity, if not more social complexity, than chimps do. And yet she had banged on and on and on about how they're, oh, look at how they act. You could do the same thing to a pride of lions. You can go right to the go right to Tanzania, to the Okavango Delta, or wherever you want to go in any other part of Africa, the Serengeti. Do the same thing with a large troop of lions controlled by a few dominant males, and give a Shangri-La image that lions live in peace and harmony. And yet you exclude this entire aspect of what they really are, because you study one troop of chimpanzees for all these years with no other sample sizes. You anthropomorphize them to the point where you act like they're just living in harmony with nature, and then you're exposed to the brutal, violent reality of what chimps are. Then claim, oh, it's just like human beings waging war. No, it's like a group of animals doing what animals do. We then go on. Their subsequent studies by their scientists confirmed that such violent behavior territory wars were not unique to Gombe. Similar patterns were observed in 18 different African chimpanzee communities, validating Goodall's observations. But this doesn't change the fact that she anthropomorphized the chimps. This doesn't change the fact that she influenced their behavior. This, again, is just trying to salvage her reputation. Oh, you validated my findings that chimps are violent. I'm like, good for you, Goodall. Because she was making observations, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was this. The issue is anthropomorphizing the animals they're researching. The problem is that she's influenced their interactions. It's still shit methodology. Very, very bad methodology. This is not how you do science. This is not how you study animals in the wild. And we've spent decades having to chip through and sift through the gigantic pile of utter horseshit that she has left for the rest of the scientific community when it comes to primates. And even to this day, her research has continued to influence and color how people view these animals. After exterminating the Kahama tribe, the Kasakela took over their territory. However, the victory was short-lived. A large group of chimpanzees, the Kalande, invaded the newly acquired land. Faced with superior numbers, the Kasakala retreated to their original territory, bringing the conflict to a close in 1978. Despite the initial controversy, her work remains a cornerstone in studying primate behavior and dramatically enhanced our understanding of close relatives. So again, her work was still useful. You can still glean some good things out of her research. But the Gombe War, to this day, remains one of the most controversial parts of her career. Sure, she observed them, but the Gombe War went directly against the narrative presented by her and other people in the scientific community that were on her side, trying to portray chimps as empathetic and feeling and human-like animals when they're not. So, unfortunately for Goodall, this just kind of proves that they're violent psychopath. I mean, they're not even psychopathic. They're just animals. They're not proto-humans. They're not almost human. They're not human-like. They're animals. They just happen to look kind of humanoid, but they're not humans. They're not even closely related to humans. And if you act like they are, I'm like, okay, we're closely related to mice too. Only 3% genetic difference between chimpanzees' relatedness to us and a mouse's relatedness to us, and yet it stands that human beings are the most divergent animal. If you're part of one of these, anti-atalists in academia that wants to downgrade what humans are to just animals, They want to elevate these chimps and downgrade us and meet us somewhere in the middle. And yet, here we go. 54-year study suggests coordinated aggression innate to chimpanzees and not linked to human interference. Because that was the big thing, like, oh, you caused this. But the big thing is like, look at how much backtracking we've had to do because of Jane Goodall. Because of Jane Goodall, because she can't do objective science, because so much of her original study was colored by her own bias, we've had to spend the next half a century replicating this so that we could actually get decent data from it, because the way she did it originally was unusable and non-conclusive. We had to go back and reproduce this study with proper methodology over a 54-year period, when if she had used proper methodology in the first place, we could have saved our time or built upon this in a more meaningful way. Instead, we have to go back and retcon and redo all of her work because she did such a shitty job of it. And yet, this is the lady we're lauding and praising as this great primatologist, and yet she's caused half a decade or half a century of regression in the field because of her methodology. Sure, she did a lot of good, but she also caused a half a century long headache because of the implications of what chimp aggression means. Because she completely and utterly failed to keep up proper objective methodology in the scientific method when doing her studies. So none of it could really be used. Violence is a natural part of life for chimpanzees. They don't need to be fed bananas to kill each other. So the compassionate, joyful, empathetic chimp is non-existent. It doesn't exist. The data is clear. When we actually go back and redo her research, we don't find it. The empathetic chimp is a myth conjured up by Jane Goodall. And we've had to spend over half a century revising this lie, revising this falsehood, this charade that she did to get more clout and more approval from the masses and the general scientific community. Now, let's go back. I think now I'm going to show you the paper I was talking about, because I didn't actually share this. But here's the paper I used: tool use and tool making in wild chimpanzees. And if you go down to the results section, you'll see the Thai chimpanzees. If you look at the introduction, that's what I am going to go to. In the wild, only chimpanzees have been observed to make tools. Assessing. So you can read through a lot of this yourself. I kind of advise you to do so. Knowing that females to be the keenest tool users. So let's see. Habituation to human observers was a slow process, and only after 5 years we were able to follow by sight some of the males. So it's already hard to kind of see these guys. But what they did say, after 8 years of observations and in 45 months of initial observation, Goodall saw ant dipping only once, although it was common in Gombe. So already they're finding inconclusive tool use. Some chimpanzee bands don't do tool use at all. Others, like the Gombe band, were prolific at using it, but mostly only females. And then when they actually did use tools, when we actually go down here to the chart, it's handfuls of chimps over long periods of time. And oftentimes, they're doing things like ant dipping, which we see in corvids. They're doing things that we see in multiple non-human animals. Crows have a better tool use repertoire and more sophisticated tool use handling, and learn tool use in a quicker time, like New Caledonian crows, much faster than chimps do. And yet, when we learned about tool use in chimps, they acted like it was some groundbreaking, earth-shattering event. And here's another thing that they also tried to show: the idea of the vocal ape, the idea that apes can inherently understand language. And a big part of this is actually being shilled by one person, and that was, let me see. I think it mentions her in the article. I should scroll down. Oh no, it's in another one. So, a female chimpanzee named Washoe kicked off a man's earnest quest to teach chimps human language. She was born in Africa in 1965. Again, the same time period as Jane Goodall. This is not a coincidence, folks. Eventually taken to Washoe County, where she became the subject of cognitive research performed by Alan and Beatrix Gardner. The chimp wowed the world when he successfully learned American Sign Language, which had never happened before in a non-human primate. Washoe then passed her skills on to her adopted son Lewis. At the time she died in 2016, Washoe had mastered around 130 signs. So what they discovered, though, although Nim memorized 150 signs, research discovered his proficiency sprang from intimidation or imitation of his teacher rather than unprompted communication. Like Washoe, Nim hadn't cracked the code on spontaneous human-like communication. So, at the same exact time as, because we also talked about like the 70s, the mid 70s was when this whole myth started to unravel. All throughout the 60s, or the late 60s and the early 70s, this idea of the precognitive chimp, the pre-sapient chimp, the human-like chimp, the empathetic chimp, the tool-using language-speaking chimp, turned out to all be a giant fraud. It turned out to be a giant myth. Wool pulled over the eyes of everybody. And one of the biggest pushes of this, and here's another paper that actually, because I hate just showing pop science articles, I'm actually going to show you guys a decent paper. But here's a paper detailing this, talking about symbolization language in chimpanzees. So, by the end of training, chimpanzees were able to reintegrate and reorganize skills which initially had only been partially mastered in their learning rates of new words. Their extended appropriate use thereof became strongly evidenced. Caution is extended regarding the use of word in response to his ape, be it with a sign of American Sign Language, a plastic token, or lexigram. Their levels of wordness and the symbolic deconceptualized level is only achieved through the course of experiences. What this basically means is that they still cannot do spontaneous language. It's still just a form of imitation. They can't make words, they can just make associations. That's not language. You're teaching, it's like teaching a parrot to talk. The parrot's not really talking. When Apollo the parrot asked for pistache, yeah, sure, there's a wordiness to it, but we have greater lexicon. And again, an African gray parrot just demonstrates better association skills than a chimpanzee does. Does that make the African gray parrot pre-human, pre-sapient? Is it empathetic? Chimps aren't even the most cognitively impressive animals. They're not, there's birds that are more intelligent than chimpanzees. But you have to look at, where does a lot of this come from? I actually had a decent article here pulled up from another researcher. Where is she? So there was one other lady, and I don't know why or how my tab got messed up here, so bear with me. I think I accidentally copy-pasted. Nope. It was like Sue something. Sue, what's her face? I think it was Project Nim. And there was also Coco the gorilla and all this other crap that people used. Sue Savage Roomba. So Sue Savage Roomba, the one who actually made this is where I was going. So Sue Savage Roomba, what happens if I actually look up Sue Savage Roomba? Looking up her, the Ape Testimony Project, she was actually, and this is something that's actually pretty funny, she was accused of actual neglect and improper treatment of her animals, which in and of itself makes you wonder. So they say the sanctuary cleared her of endangering apes through her research. They basically canned her. The same person that talked about, the chimps might be able to learn studies and lexicograms and all this stuff, and talked about how they were able to learn hundreds of lexicograms. But here we go, already showing that The bonobo, so they're like, oh, well, the bonobos are well cared for. The accusations are not corroborated, but it does make you think about the methodology being used in her studies when this became a concern, or not even a concern, just the fact that. So charges by 11 former employees that she endangered 7 bonobos in her factory facility in Des Moines. And remember, the more well-connected you are in academia, you're untouchable. Professors get tenure, and so do people like this. But looking at her career, the Ape Testimony Project by Cornell, they say Sue Savage Rumbaugh is a world famous psychologist and primatologist. More than 4 decades, she worked with great apes and human language, first at the University of Omaha, then the Yerka Center, blah, blah, blah. Dialogues on the Human Ape is one of her best drops, her well known research. And since 2013, she's been excluded from the lab once created for her work. She's been prevented from interacting with the members of the bonobo community. The issue with this lady is that just like Jane Goodall, just like all of these other female researchers in psychology, primatology, anthropology, biology, natural sciences, period, they cannot separate emotion and logic. They cannot separate the subjective and the objective when they do science. This is one of the biggest issues I have with the quotification, with the DEIification of science. This is the main issue, guys, is that people like her, people like Jane Goodall, researchers like this that cannot separate their own emotions from science end up causing more problems, discrediting the entire field through their actions. So, you know what? RIP. So, RIP to Jane Goodall. RIP to all these people. Actually, I'm going to make myself tiny again. It's getting dark in here. But, you know, RIP. RIP. For sure. You know, I think that Jane Goodall, again, Jane Goodall did good, some good for the field. But as you can see, she also led to a lot of problems, a lot of retconning, a lot of controversy. And unfortunately, you have to think to yourself and wonder, what should I believe? And not even to mention, getting into her later works, if I go and look up Jane Goodall and I see what she was involved with, I mean, she did a lot of good. She was involved in conservation, Master of Peace, saved the chimps, yada, yada, yada. But she was also involved with some kind of shady individuals. So the World Future Council, her involvement with the World Future Council, that's a good one. So according to futurepolicy.org, the futurepolicy.org website presents a political solutions and assists decision makers in developing and implementing future just policies. It's an online database designed for policymakers to simplify the sharing of existing proven policy solutions and tackle the world's most fundamental and urgent problems. It now contains policies, for example, on renewable energies, energy efficiency, sustainable cities, and food production in the era of climate change that has been promoted in WFC publications, films, and hearings. And what have I always said? Be careful of listening to people who are trying to sell you something. Also, groovy lighting. I like the dark lighting. But always be skeptical of people trying to sell you something. Be skeptical of Sue Savage Rumbaugh, almost said Rush Limbaugh, Sue Savage Rumbaugh, and Jane Goodall's. R.I.P. Jane Goodall. But I'm honestly glad there's less of you. We need objective science, not emotionally driven, boo-hoo. We don't need psychologists. We don't need the empathetic, weird projection of human emotions onto animals. That's not how ethology's done. We've had to spend half a century retconning your research, Jane Goodall. So rest in peace, because ethologists are not going to. We're going to have to spend decades constantly rewriting the research that you've done. And after 54 years, we finally get the real picture, and people are still making excuse for Jane Goodall. Like, she's such a great and wonderful person. And sure, she might be a good person, but she's a terrible scientist, dude. Like, I can't lie. Her methodology, the way she anthropomorphized her animals, the way she got personally attached to her subjects, that is not how you do science, bro. That's not how you do ethology. And it's proof that when somebody has an agenda, when somebody belongs to organizations that try to present a certain message, frame humanity a certain way, frame the natural world a certain way, they're not doing science. They're doing propaganda. Rest in peace. Also, it's not letting me in the stream, so I guess I'm just gonna stay up here with you guys because I care about you so much.